All right. Do you have a Oh, wait. Starting recording. Yes. Do you have a notification that says Youri's recording the call?
Do I what?
Do you have a message that says Youri's recording the call right now?
No. Oh, yeah, up in the right. Correct.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, here it goes. All right. Okay, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. On the program tonight, so excited and so honored to welcome back our returning champion to the program, Rick Sterling. Rick is a Canadian-American peace activist, independent journalist, media critic, NGO critic, anti-imperialist campaigner. Often his typed work you can find at Mintpress, antiwar.com, Consortium News, Counterpunch. And he's on to talk to me about a recent trip he made to Russia and the region of Crimea. So it's our All Things Eastern Europe edition, All Things Post-Communist, Former and Current Communist State edition. And being as this is the 204th episode, it's especially wonderful to have Rick back on the program because we recently celebrated our 200th episode. But Rick, you and Eve Angler have a special place in my heart because the first interview I ever did, even before 1+1, was on behalf of Black Agenda Report, and you were the second guest. So anywho, welcome back to the program, and it's a real honor to have you back on.
Yeah, thanks very much, Youri. Congratulations on doing 204 broadcasts, and looking forward to it.
And thank you very much for that. And Rick, the first question I wanted to ask you before we get to before we talk about your recent trip to Russia with your comrade Dan Kovalek, and people should get all of his books. I have the one he did about Russia, which is a must read. But I cannot, but before we talk about this, I have to ask you your reflections on Syria, because I think it's safe to say the Western Gulf War on Syria has more or less ended. Well, certainly the Gulf states and Turkey have ceased their hostilities. Syria has been welcomed back to the Arab League. All of this not too long after China helped broke detente, ending a cold sectarian war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. This is a positively incredible outcome that the government of Assad, the ruling Baathist government, and their coalition partners have defeated Western Gulf-backed Wahabi radical Islamist death squads, called them ISIS al-Nusra. However, despite winning militarily, the U.S. and its allies are still, although they've abandoned trying to overthrow the government militarily, they're now, Syria, unfortunately, like Vietnam, has to deal with economic terrorism and economic sanctions, economic blockade. That plus the occasional Israel bombing for no reason. Israel doing the dirty work of the imperialist bullies. So I just wanted your thoughts on the Western Gulf War de facto ending in Syria. And again, this is unprecedented because I think not since the country of Vietnam has there been such a remarkable victory over Western imperialism, Gulf imperialism, and pan-European imperialism. Again, President Assad, with the help of Russia, to a degree, Iran and Hezbollah. I think this might be controversial to say, I might be calling Assad for this, but I think he deserves to be in that list of heroes and anti-heroes who, despite so much devastation, that are a relentless enemy, he has saved his country from tragic chaos and the destruction that was visited on Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Sudan, and countless others. So again, your thoughts on all of this when it comes to Syria.
I think, briefly, I think you're exactly right that Assad did save Syria, and with support from, ultimately Russia and Iran and Hezbollah, as you correctly point out. But it was the Syrian people, really, that decisively decided that they did not want to become a sectarian state, that they did not believe in Wahabi fundamentalism, and united and resisted through Now it's going on 12 years or 12 years of bloodshed and mayhem and chaos. I was in Damascus once a couple of years ago, and a shop owner had a picture of Assad behind his desk. And just out of curiosity, I asked him, why do you have a picture of President Assad there? And without looking up from what he was doing, he said to me, because he saved Syria. And you could tell the sincerity in his voice. And they honestly believed that. That was around the time of that was actually in June 2021, at the time of the election in Syria of President Assad. And I was there. The enthusiasm was amazing. I remember talking with a couple of young women, traditional Muslim garb, and she simply said, the U.S. wants to subjugate us. And that's why we're for President Assad. He wants Syria to be a free state and a secular state. I think the breakthrough now with China brokering the deal and negotiating the deal, bringing Saudi Arabia and Iran together. Of course, this is the nightmare scenario of Israel and the U.S. And there's one very interesting element of this that has not been remarked on very much. I first saw my colleague Helena Cobbin at Just World Education. She noted this. A very important factor is it caught the United States completely by surprise. U.S. and Israeli intelligence officials were completely in the dark about these negotiations, and that's why it was such a shock. And what this says is that they had secure communications between China, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. That is extremely important. So the U.S. couldn't subvert it, sabotage it. They couldn't destabilize or disrupt the communications, the agreement. And that's one interesting element of all this. But you're right that it's a milestone. The people of Syria are still suffering, but rejoining the Arab League, which they should never have been pushed out of,
exactly,
is an important milestone. And it's a tacit admission that the forces there, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, were mistaken in what they were doing, and the door is open now to investments, to regaining the economy. Saudi Arabia is moving away from the petrodollar, the requirement that sale of oil be done with U.S. dollars. And so the U.S. stranglehold on Saudi Arabia is going to be greatly weakened. And so this is a very important milestone in the Middle East, and really an important milestone in terms of the struggle for a multipolar world, as opposed to the current unipolar world where the U.S. Dictates the rules of the world for whatever's their own advantage.
And two very quick follow-ups on Syria before we talk about Russia, Crimea, and the Ukraine war is any criticisms and lessons towards the anti-war, anti-imperialist movement and the left you'd like to make with respect to Syria. And I've been seeing a lot of positive coverage of Mintpress news. I know our comrades, the International Manifesto Group, is going to have another fantastic super panel about Saudi Arabia and about Saudi Arabia and Iran making peace with another, thanks to China, and Saudi Arabia probably might join BRICS, but, and this is a but, and but I can't celebrate Saudi Arabia possibly joining BRICS because Saudi Arabia has been Saudi Arabia is the reason why the Middle East is in the mess. They export the most reactionary fundamentalist version of of Islam. They are the reason why Afghanistan is a basket case. They are the reason why Iraq, other basket case. They have been mostly a partner in crime, to the Anglo-American empire. And while they talk a whole lot of crap about Palestinian solidarity, they do lots of wheeling and dealing with Israel behind the scenes. And what they almost did to Syria, which is trying to make Syria into Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, I just can't forgive Saudi Arabia for that, and I just don't find that Saudi Arabia is a country you can trust. And I'm wondering, with the Chinese trying to eradicate Uyghur extremism, which Saudi Arabia and Turkey have been involved in that separatist movement. I mean, can we really? I'm just wondering, can we really celebrate Saudi Arabia? Because I just don't trust Saudi Arabia. So I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Well, I guess the first thought is the Saudi government is the responsibility of the Saudi people, and it's up to them at the end of the road to change their government. Other governments around the world, whether they're Iran or Russia or Syria, will negotiate with the acting government of Saudi Arabia, and if they can come to agreements that's in all of those countries' interests, they do so. And I think that's right. So President Assad went to Riyadh. He met with MBS. Iran came to the agreement despite all of the hostility, animosity, all of the bad deeds that you are, correctly noting. They came to the agreement, and they said that continuing the warfare is bad for us. It's bad for you. Let's mend fences. And so I think that's to be celebrated. One has to be cautious, but certainly Saudi Arabia moving away from their tight relationship with the United States and indirectly with Israel is a very positive move for the world and the Middle East especially.
Interesting. Okay, that's given me. Yeah, you've given me a lot to ponder about that. So that's a subject that we should definitely visit in the future. But and actually, you were talking about détente. That's a perfect segue to why I wanted to talk to you about your trip to Russia. So alrighty. So now on to Russia and the Ukraine-Russia-NATO war. Describe to our audience what was the mood like in Russia when you went there. How are the people faring? Because whatever criticisms and opposition one might have regarding Russia's military action in Ukraine, and I don't support Russia's military action in Ukraine, which we can talk to later. I simply can't support the extreme over-the-top sanctions and cultural boycotts of Russia. And I was wondering what impacts can you see visibly the sanctions have had on the largely Russian working class and the very precarious middle class, and have you and the people you've spoken to, what have they said about the extreme boycott and sanctions that's been placed on that's been placed on Russia, on their country?
We asked that to numerous people wherever we were, whether in St. Petersburg or Moscow or any of the numerous cities in Crimea that we visited, and the overwhelming response was, well, the sanctions are there, but they're not having a big impact. We went into stores purposely to just see the condition of stores. We went into very modern shopping malls in St. Petersburg. We went into sporting goods stores in Moscow. They're stacked to the rafters with modern gear and equipment, and they've got lots of customers. The unemployment in Russia is low. The ruble has maintained its standing. In fact, it's even gone ahead. It's improved in terms of relation with in comparison with Western European currencies. So the sanctions the prediction of the West that they could cripple, they could badly damage the Russian economy and bring Moscow to its knees, that's completely failed. The mood on the streets is by and large positive. People are sad about the war, but there's not a sense that it's not when you go to Russia, it's not like you're aware of the war. And it's not they call it a special military operation because they have not mobilized to a war economy, a war mentality among the public.
Interesting.
The operation is going on. People are saddened because they genuinely feel like Ukrainians were their brothers and sisters. There's a very, very long history of collaboration and unity. In fact, the capital of Rus or Russia at one time was Kiev. So there's a very long history of brotherly connections, sisterly connections, and people are extremely sad about it. But they, at the same time, there's the widespread belief that it had to be done. It was necessary. Why was it necessary? Because the aggression from the West has just been nonstop. Of course, there were the promises in the 1990s that NATO wouldn't expand one inch to the east. The Warsaw Pact, ceased being a pact of countries. NATO did the exact opposite. They added country after country. They moved more and more to the east, brought in Romania, brought in Poland. Under Bush II, the U.S. withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which was a very important thing, because if your game plan is a first strike, what you have is your anti-ballistic missiles all primed and ready to go. After you launch the first strike, you know that the adversary is going to be launching missiles back to you. That's why you have an anti-ballistic missile, ready to go. And so withdrawing from that treaty was a huge step. Then NATO installed missiles which can be fitted with nuclear missiles in Romania and Poland. Then they declared that Georgia and Russia would be welcomed into NATO, and of course in 2007. So all of these things, Russia was protesting, was saying, "Stop! Don't you realize this? This is a red line for us." I'm sure your listeners, everybody's aware of these things. But then there was the coup in 2014 with the U.S. hands all over it. Victoria Nuland acknowledged that they had spent $5 billion since the 1990s trying to quote unquote bring democracy to Ukraine. That's $5 billion. In addition to that, you have all sorts of mega billionaires like George Soros, who was investing hundreds of millions of dollars. So all of these things going on. Then you had the civil war, which we began after the coup in Kiev, and the secession of Crimea immediately, and then the war. A lot of people said to us that when we asked about them, they said they're really saddened, but they understand it was necessary. We heard people say that their relatives and friends who live in the Donbass, eastern Ukraine, had been pleading with them for years, saying, "Why isn't Russia doing anything?" as they were under assault by Kiev. Mm-hmm. Of course, in the West, the war began on February 24 of 2022, when actually it began 8 years previously in the spring of 2014. The civil war had been going on for 8 years before Russia stepped in. Why did they step in when they did? Now, and a lot of people, as I was saying, feel that Russia should have intervened earlier. They don't think it was wrong to intervene. They think that Russia should have intervened earlier. But of course, they did not, because Russia, with Sergei Lavrov, of the head of the foreign ministry, and Vladimir Putin, the head of the government, they trusted in the Minsk Accord. They trusted in the agreement that was signed, that was supposed to be, under the guardianship and under the enactment of France and Germany, with the agreement of Kiev. And then, as we learned later on, just 15 months ago, 16 months ago, when the leaders of both Germany and France admitted they had never intended to honor the Minsk agreement. It had always been something that was used to give time to Crimea, for NATO to NATO-ize Ukraine, even though it wasn't a de facto member, it wasn't a de jure member, it was a de facto member. The NATO training, NATO weapons. You had California National Guard in Ukraine training Ukrainian soldiers, and they trained up, many, many tens of thousands. So, well, I'm not sure how much you want to talk about this right now.
Actually, no. Actually, all of that's all. I'm actually really glad that you laid all that out, because it is very important. And again, I agree with you. Many people think, many people, certainly the whole Stand with Ukraine cult, thinks that Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that's where history starts. And no, history starts much longer than that. And even though I think it's also important, to know that even though historically Ukrainians do have some legitimate grievance with their bigger neighbor, the Russians, but the fact of the matter is, the West, starting with the counter revolutions and the color revolutions of that led to the end of the USSR, the West was backing the most reactionary movements. They were backing a bunch of wolves in sheep's clothing, which explains why the neo-Nazi movement, the Banderites movement, and the lionizing of Nazi collaborators and so forth, and all of these well-funded expat groups, not just Ukraine, but the entire region of Eastern Europe, all of these expat groups, which all have seemingly very innocent-sounding names, like the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, or the Czechoslovakian-Canadian Congress, Estonian Congress, were all founded by a bunch of runaway Nazi war criminals. And I think just like the late Glenn Ford, in one of his last speeches, which Your World News recorded, Glenn Ford said, And just like Obama supported Islamic jihadis in Syria, Obama installed Nazi militias in Ukraine. And I'm talking about real Nazis, real white Nazis with swastikas and doing the salutes, and then talking about how Ukraine is now the #1 place of Nazi tourism, where pro-Nazis go amongst their kind. So again, even though Ukraine does have legitimate grievances with Russia, Eastern Europe in general does have legitimate grievances towards Russia, the West, though, was backing the most reactionary movements, not, the more left movement or whatever progressive movement, which could have, reconciled some of those things. So I'm glad you mentioned that. But then, if the economic sanctions and much of the Western-led boycotts aren't having too much of a negative impact on Russia, then what has been the remedy counterforce to that? What's the reason behind that?
Yeah.
One sec. Starting. Okay. Is it working again?
Yes.
Okay. We're back with Rick Sterling talking about his trip to Russia and the Ukraine-Russia-NATO war. So I was asking you, Rick, before we had to pause briefly, if the economic sanctions and much of the Western-led boycotts aren't having too much of a negative impact on Russia, what has what has been the remedy counterforce to that? Why hasn't the sanctions badly impacted Russia?
I think because the U.S. started sanctioning Russia, in a serious way back in 2014, after Russia reunified or absorbed Crimea, and I'm hoping we can talk about that later. But afterwards, both Crimea and Russia came under heavy sanctions, and the hybrid warfare against Russia really stepped up. Some of this was in the sporting world, international sporting world, where the U.S. claims of, quote, state-sponsored doping and other accusations were made. In the economic sphere, credit cards didn't work in Crimea. I was there in 2016. I made a trip to Russia, and then including Crimea in 2016 and again in 2017. And already at that time, we were hearing Russians say the best thing that ever happened to Russian farming and agriculture were the sanctions, because Western Europe stopped exporting some agricultural produce to Russia, and that forced them to greatly expand their domestic agriculture, and it had a very positive effect. And now I think that was a bit of a training ground and a preparation. And I think also that Russian leaders correctly realized that this wasn't a temporary thing, that the United States attempts to undermine and destabilize Russia were not going to go away. They were not just a passing fad. This was going to be continuous. And so they started developing other forms of trade. They started increasing their trade with the East. They started giving incentives to new industries that could fill the gap. And so I think there were serious preparations underway to make the economy less vulnerable to Western sanctions and to have more self-reliance. So that's one factor. And then they have managed things. They have managed things rather well. The gas and the oil that they used to export to the West, they have simply increased their exports to the East. Now, ironically, India is a big supplier of oil is supplying some oil and gas to West Europe. They're simply reselling the Russian oil and gas and paying a premium for it. So I think I think that's some of these factors are at play in the increased cost of living in West Europe. I think there's been less of that. In fact, I think the sanctions have hurt West Europe and even North America more than they've hurt Russia, to be honest. As I was saying, the stores are full there of merchandise, of quality merchandise, and they've got lots of customers as well. This was from my visits to stores in Moscow and St. Petersburg and in Crimea for that matter. Now, going back to your point about the neo-Nazis and there's been in the Western media has completely whitewashed this. They've completely pretended it didn't exist. That they're now often they're often saying that this is just Russian propaganda. Where I was noticing a 2019 video, so it's not it's 4 years old now. That's not very old. By Time magazine about the neo-Nazi movement. And in Congress passed legislation saying that military aid to Ukraine, they had to exclude the Azov Battalion and none of this aid could go to these neo-Nazi forces who they now celebrate. And the exclusions have been dropped, of course. And now you're not supposed to talk about that. The fact that Stepan Bandera was a Nazi collaborator, the person who's being celebrated by the Slava Ukraini, people.
Yeah, and it's been quite disturbing sometimes. Sometimes when you see the whole stand with Ukraine campaign. Okay, if you're waving the Ukrainian flag, that's one thing. That's not controversial to me. Where I start having red flags and where I start thinking, do you guys know what that symbol is when they start waving all of these flags or wear football jerseys with the right sector and the Svoboda party, the two the two Banderites, far right ultra nationalist Ukrainian parties, and having those symbols now imposed with much of the Ukraine flags, and that's where I go. That's where I go. Okay, look. No, I'm not going to stand with Ukraine like that. I will stand with the people who want peace, both sides, both sides of the, of this conflict. That's a perfect segue to this question I wanted to ask, which is, were you and Dan able to talk to individual Russians or Russians who are members of groups that are opposed to the special military operation in Ukraine, who even if some of these folks think that Russia is in the right, they simply believe that that war shouldn't have been an option due to the backlash it would produce with Finland joining NATO now, Sweden trying to join NATO, the very extreme cultural and economic boycotts that the West has inflicted on Russia. And then just before you answer that, a past guest of mine on this show, Małgorzata Kubacka-Figuet, a brilliant Polish indie journalist, she was telling me that there are feminist groups and other peace groups in Russia who are trying to speak out, mentioned to me that the conscription of Russian soldiers was mostly men, but was rather discriminatory, and it's mostly minorities and marginalized Russians who are being sent, and they don't want to fight, and some try to engage in draft dodging. So I'm curious your response to both of those, both of those things.
The people we talked with who don't support the government and who don't support the SMO were young people who are, I think it's fair to say, are not very well informed. They were born after the 1990s. They think the 1990s were a good time to get rich. They tend to romanticize the United States. I can safely say they have no clue to the condition of cities in the United States now, where there are thousands of homeless people in many cities. There's tens of thousands in some cities.
Nationwide, on top of that.
So there are, and we spoke with some people like this who, that's their opinion. For example, one young woman, 19 years old, she works in a cafe, which is how we met her, and a very charming young person. She spoke English. She's studying at St. Petersburg University. She's training to be a flight control, air traffic control person. Mm-hmm. But she wants to go to the United States. She knows that Starbucks has been replaced by Stars. They changed the name. And they improved the coffee. And she admits the coffee at Starbucks is bad, but she just liked the U.S. vibe and the music choice and so forth. So it was interesting to chat with her, where she gets all of her information from social media, which I think is can be pretty easily influenced.
In other words, she's not watching putting aside putting aside an outlet like RT, but she's not watching outlets like she wouldn't know about 1+1, but she's definitely not watching like outlets like Democracy Now, Pacifica Radio, or any of these outlets. A lot of them who I don't agree with their coverage on on Russia and Ukraine, but like corporate media, corporate state dominated media like BBC, ABC,
Right.
CBC, and all of those outlets.
Right, and we asked her what outlet. Of course, she's Russian, so she's going to seek an outlet. I mean, her English was very good, but she would be seeking Russian outlets. And I asked her for those, but I've yet to look up the exact ones that she mentioned. But no, she does not ever watch the Russian state media. And she doesn't read newspapers. Now, this is widespread in the West, of course, as well. I mean, I can think of my own kids. They don't watch cable TV, and they also get a lot of information off of, but they will select their podcast to follow, but. So this was a person, and she had no qualms about talking with us and expressing these views. That was interesting. I asked her if she thinks it's accurate that Putin has the support of 80% of the population, and she said no. Among her friends, it's 20% of the population. So it's, but then, when we asked her about the 1990s, and she thought that was a good time to get rich, that kind of gave a clue into her lack of education. Of course, I mean, she's 19, so she was only born in 2004. So she didn't experience what happened after the Soviet Union collapsed and after the
civilizational downgrade. I mean,
exactly.
The Chinese refer to their period of endless colonization as the century of humiliation. The 1990s was a century of not just humiliation, but it was a civilizational downgrade. The Yeltsin years, and I have, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have to respond to that because I thought that most Russians, even those who do believe in capitalism and some kind of libertarianism, I always thought that they disliked the period of the 90s as a very dark time. So some of them don't want to over glorify the USSR period, but for many people, but I always thought that for the Russian public at large, no, the 90s was a terrible period. They don't ever want to repeat that. And whatever criticisms they do have of Putin, they still think he is much better and is doing more to try to improve people's lives compared to the awful 90s. I'm quite shocked that you actually met people who harken back to that period.
But it's just an indication that there's a segment of the population who are not aware of it's reflective on the education process and how people are being influenced. Now, I mean, there's a lot of statistics that show how life improved after 2000 under Putin, how even the life expectancy of people had dropped significantly during the 1990s, not just from suicides, but not just from the absence of health care, through all sorts of means. People were living much shorter lives, and they were living much more miserable lives than previously. So, and that's the vast majority. I'm very confident in saying that. I asked another person if he thought the polls giving Putin 80% popularity were accurate, and he said yes, but it's not 100%. They approve, but they don't approve 100%. They may approve 51% or 60% or 70%. So it's not like everybody's in lockstep with all the decisions of the president, but the vast majority of the public realizes that things have improved and that they're they believe they're headed in the right direction.
But those Russians who are opposed to Russia's military action in eastern Ukraine. So is there an anti-war movement? And I don't even care if it's left or right, but is there an anti-war movement in Russia which even if they think Russia is completely in the right when we talk about these endless Cold Wars, but that they just don't support Russia's military action due to the backlash it produced, like Finland joining NATO, the West being much more Russophobic and anti-Russia, Putin derangement syndrome than it already was, or your response to that?
Well, we didn't meet a lot of people like that. Most of the people we met and observed on the street were patriotic, and we were there, at the end of April and in early May. We were there for 20 days. And as much as I was mentioning to you, the 19-year-old person that we talked to in St. Petersburg, in Crimea, we observed. We didn't meet them. We observed them, and then we just chatted and said hi. Numerous groups of teenagers that were singing patriotic songs in advance of May 9 Victory Day. They had the St. George's ribbon on. They were totally authentic. There was one group of I think it was five young women from the theater college, or the theater department of the local university, who were singing patriotic songs, being filmed by one of their friends, a boy, to post who knows where. But they were very enthusiastic and vibrant. So there's a lot of that, a lot of older people. The older generation, of course, has the perspective of the Soviet Union. There were the hopes that the West would somehow bring about these miracles. Then they realized that, whoa, wait a minute, we lost so much. We lost free housing. We lost free health care. We lost, so many people lost jobs. We had the rise of crime. We had the oligarchy. And
organized crime on top of that, which was unheard of during the USSR period.
Exactly. And one thing I can tell you, which is interesting, in St. Petersburg and Crimea, and anybody who's gone to, big cities and even smaller, medium-sized cities will get a sense of whether or not it's dangerous. How many people are, scoping you out on the street? And Moscow and St. Petersburg just felt like really safe cities. There wasn't any sense, and I think the crime levels there are very low, actually. So compared to a U.S. city, let alone cities in other parts of the world, the level of safety is quite high. It's in terms of healthcare, I think also they have in each district has their health facility, which will have a number of doctors, will have an ability to make an evaluation and do quick treatment. And if it requires surgery, then there's a nearby hospital for the more intense care. But each community has a healthcare facility. So it's coming from the U.S. That seemed like a very good model to follow.
Fascinating.
So, but in terms of the attitude, the attitude of people that we met was a bit somber in a sense, but optimistic. And they're sad at the conflict. They want the conflict to end. Numerous people said, we need to take the gloves off. In contrast with most reports from Western media, which, the brutal invasion, and they're bombing apartment buildings all over the place, they're killing civilians randomly. I don't think that's accurate at all. If apartment buildings are targeted, it's because they're full of military people.
Interesting you say that. That's a perfect segue then to that's actually a perfect segue to this question, which is I wanted your response to this claim, which also came from my comrade and past guest Małgorzata on on the war, and Małgorzata said that while some in the anti-imperialist movement and the anti-NATO camp do think that Russia and Eastern Ukrainians do have legitimate grievances and concerns regarding NATO expansion and Western meddling in Ukrainian affairs, which has led to this terrible situation. She was saying that from her research and dealing with the Ukrainian community in Poland, those from both the East and the West who had to flee, she said that Russia's invasion has only been counterproductive, not only because it further inflamed Russophobia and anti-Russia attitudes, but that most of the targets Russia has done, in Ukraine, the collateral damage that Russia has done has been mostly in the East, which these are the people that the Russians claim they are trying to help, but when damaging a gas station, when targeting electricity supplies or water, or even people's livelihoods, like a shopping mall or a center, that's only intensified the Banderite movement and more broadly only inflamed anti-Russia attitudes. Of course, innocent lives do get lost in war. I know a Ukrainian, girlfriend of girlfriend of one of my best ones who lost, her, who lost a family member under the age of 5 due to due to Russia's invasion. She came from eastern Ukraine, Kharkiv, which was the first place that Russia invaded. So yes, so I just wanted your your response to all of that.
Well, I think your friend, and she was an interviewee. I think she's raising good questions, and she may be right. I haven't. I don't have a strong opinion on that. Whether the one question, the one issue that I think is clear is that the U.S. wanted this to happen. I think the provocation wasn't accidental; it was intentional by the U.S. I think they were looking at the collapse of the Soviet Union, which followed their intervention in Afghanistan. Now, the two aren't tied directly together, but certainly the intervention in Afghanistan by the Soviet Union, which and they withdrew in 1987 or 88, around that time. That was a negative factor in the Soviet Union. And I think it's generally considered, especially by followers of Zbigniew Brzezinski, that that was a significant factor, that was a good thing, and that they want to repeat it. And so I think that has been a factor in the U.S. actually wanting Russia to intervene in Ukraine as a means to undermine and sabotage it, weaken. And ultimately, they would like to break up Russia into several pieces. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his famous book, The Grand Chessboard, talked about that. In fact, just shortly after the Russian invasion began at the end of February 2022, Hillary Clinton said explicitly, Afghanistan is the model. Doesn't get more explicit than that. So I think they were intentionally doing it. Did they fall into a trap? I think the Russians knew that this was being done intentionally by the U.S., but they felt they had no choice, and they obviously feel, or they felt at the time, that they can break the trap, that the situation is very different than Afghanistan, and so they did that. But a valid question whether this is, the long run strategic interest. Could they have waited longer? I mean, they waited a long time as it was, and as I was saying, many Russians and Russians with contacts in Ukraine think they waited too long. They allowed them to strengthen too much. As to the question of civilians and are Ukrainian still civilians, it's horrible to talk about dead people as collateral damage, but it's an unfortunate fact that innocent people get killed in wars. I think there are atrocities committed by all sides in wars. The bloodshed, the mayhem, the killing has a psychological effect. At the same time, I think there's a substantial difference according to the people who are fighting. I think the atrocities committed by the U.S. in Vietnam were not matched by the Vietnamese. I think the Vietnamese, I'm sure Vietnamese soldiers did their share of killing of U.S. soldiers, perhaps unarmed soldiers at times. I'm sure that happened, but I think there's a substantial difference in the amount and the intensity of the atrocities. And I think the same thing is true in Ukraine today. I believe that Russians are not intentionally targeting civilian structures. After the sabotage of the Kerch Strait bridge, they attacked infrastructure, but largely it was electrical infrastructure, it was railroad infrastructure, railroad crossings. They did knock out the lights, and which went on for some time, but they have not attacked that was an exception, I think. And I believe it's the case that the Russians are intentionally only targeting military structure. There was a U.S. analyst writing in the Washington Post in April, and he said after 1 month of war, the Russians, he said after 1 day of the invasion of Iraq, the U.S. used more bombs and to attack Iraq than the Russians had done in 30 days. So the level of intensity of bombing and attacks on that could lead to collateral damage was greatly reduced. I don't know what the current number of estimated civilian deaths in Ukraine is, but it's nowhere near the number of military deaths. I mean, the number of soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers that have been killed, maybe 100, 150. Some people even say it's more than that, 150,000. The number of civilians killed, I think it's down in the 10,000 number. So the last time I looked, which was quite a long time, which was about half a year ago, but I think it was like 5,000. Now there are people there are civilians killed, I'm sure, who are not counted for whatever reason. So that may be a low count, but my main point is that there's no comparison. Russia is targeting Ukrainian military. They're not targeting Ukrainian civilians. And another thing that points to that is that by far the most Ukrainian refugees have gone to Russia. There's 5 million Ukrainian civilians in Russia.
You're talking about people in Donbass and Luhansk who fled when basically when the Civil War broke out, when the Western-backed coup happened, and that piece of shit Poroshenko got into power and started to oppress Ukrainians of a Russian-speaking background, because Ukraine is, Ukraine is multiple identities. So you're talking about those Ukrainians of Eastern Ukraine who were fleeing, the kind of Banderites, neo-Banderite pogroms and whatnot.
Right, but I'm not sure the exact statistics, but I'm talking about since the February 24th last year. the number of refugees, the number of people who fled, whether from Kherson or Kharkiv or Lugansk or Donetsk or any of those places, by far the most have gone to Russia.
Interesting. Well, before I get to this question, I'll just say that it's just a pity that it had to come to this, that it had to, and again, while I don't like that Russia did its military actions, and I am anti-NATO, I'm an anti-imperialist, but I also do largely agree with you that the West created this cluster situation. The West has been meddling in Ukrainian affairs, has been backing reactionary movements in Ukraine, and it snowballed into Russia's invasion because like you, I do think that Russia was provoked. But that being said, with war, innocent lives get lost, and hearing the stories of the Ukrainian I know who I know is who's definitely no fan of Putin, would probably be much more hostile towards Russia compared to others in eastern Ukraine who are even thinking about joining Russia. Anywho, it's just a pity, but that's Western imperialism for you: divide and conquer. But boy, when the bitter divisions come because of imperialism, anyways, that's so yeah. Russia out of Ukraine, but NATO out of existence. So, okay, but have to get to this question then. I want your thoughts on when it comes to the long-term outcome of this really unfortunate war conflict. My colleague and friend Boyan Stanislavski, the founding editor and a co-editor of The Barricade, which is an independent pan-Eastern European outlet that covers Eastern European and international affairs, always from a critical left perspective. And on his daily YouTube show, which I'm often invited to speak on, he said numerous times, and in an episode I appeared on, the final episode of last year, he said something very interesting, which got a lot of small but very interesting media reaction from several outlets, which is the following. Boyan says this, that he believes Ukraine will simply be partitioned into 2 or 3 countries. So Western Ukraine, which will include Kiev, obviously, that'll be, that country will be aligned with the West, NATO, and the EU. Eastern Ukraine, the region of, Donetsk and Luhansk, one will secede and join the Russian Federation. The other, like Crimea, will hold a referendum, but either to join the Russian Federation or be its own country, wanting nothing to do with the rest of what will be Western Ukraine. And that region will largely be recognized by, and that region will largely be recognized as an independent state that not only Russia will recognize, but much of the international community from Latin America, Africa, China, and much of Asia, but not recognized by the US, EU, and NATO members. I'm curious your thoughts on your thoughts on that.
I think what Russia wanted was, with the Minsk agreements, was for Ukraine to be to continue as an independent country, but to recognize the relative autonomy of Donetsk and Lugansk. And so, I mean, that during the Civil War, those were the regions that effectively fought against the coup government in Kiev. But Russia, with the agreement of Germany and France and the Poroshenko government, which signed on to it, it came to an agreement that there would be respect for the relative autonomy, and especially in the sphere of language.
Yeah.
And it was the failure there. And this is the tragic outcome, that the war is completely unnecessary. If the West had basically agreed with this, if they had not been so intent on using Ukraine as a weapon to undermine and sabotage Russia, this war wouldn't have happened. It was because because the West was intent, and as laid out by Brzezinski in his book, The Grand Chessboard, and as carried out by the neocons, and especially Victoria Nuland and company.
Rand Corporation even said that they would like to provoke a conflict, so that and then after they provoke the conflict, they will try to do color revolutions and balkanize the Russian Federation.
Right. So the people that we talked with in Crimea and elsewhere in Russia, who said that that Russia waited too long, they believe that Russia should have intervened and should have basically absorbed those countries in the east that Kiev was refusing to acknowledge, is part of Ukraine, and refusing to acknowledge their cultural identity and their language. As some of your listeners will know, the first day in office of the coup government in February of 2014, the first day they removed Russian as a state language of Ukraine, preparing the ground for
apart from apart from Viktor Yanukovych, the previously elected government, the previously elected president of Ukraine, who came from Eastern Ukraine and got a lot of support for, I think he's been the only post-Soviet president of Ukraine that respected both languages, whereas the guy that came from the Orange Revolution, the corrupt female Ukrainian president that came after him, and Poroshenko all ran on the campaign of we only want Ukrainian to be the official language, and completely suppress and eradicate any Russian culture that's been in the country since since the period of the of the SARS and whatnot.
Yeah, historically the country's been very divided. The eastern part was joined with Ukraine, through various negotiations after the Bolshevik Revolution. In a speech on February 22, Putin said it was curious because there was no reason to, because the people in the Donbass were culturally distinct from the people in Western Ukraine. And by the same token, in 1954, Khrushchev, who was the Soviet premier, he was Ukrainian. He said that without consulting the people of Crimea, Crimea would cease to be an autonomous republic and had become part of the Ukraine Socialist Republic. That move was done, for whatever reasons Khrushchev had. It wasn't with the wishes of the people. So that in 1991, as the Soviet Union was falling apart, they held a referendum in Crimea, and they decided at that time to become an autonomous republic, the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. So the difference, the wish to secede, long predates to 2014. It goes back to the breakup of the Soviet Union. The people in Crimea voted decisively, we would rather be independent. And there was negotiation, there was contention with Kiev. Finally, they agreed that Ukraine would remain, or that Crimea would remain under Ukrainian administration, but as an autonomous republic. It was the Autonomous Republic of Crimea within Ukraine. And then, of course, after the coup in 2014 and all the other things that happened, for example, there were 3 residents of Crimea who were serving as police in Kiev who were killed in the protests when their bodies were brought back. There were 8 buses. There was a convoy of 8 buses with about 400 people who went to Kiev to peacefully protest anti-Maidan, to protest against the violence and the chaos taking place in the capital. After the sniper killing on February 20, they realized that peaceful protests, things have gotten way beyond this point. And you had 47 people killed, both police and protesters on the Maidan Plaza. And there's a professor, Ukrainian-Canadian professor, Ivan Ketchenovsky, who's done tremendous research on this, proving that the snipers were all located on opposition-controlled buildings. In other words, this was being done to spark the upheaval which led to the coup, which indeed did take place a couple of days later. In any case, the buses that left Kiev heading back to Crimea with all of the Crimeans, they got stopped by a blockade at night on the highway and were brutalized, beaten, and 7 killed. The word of this, of course, spread immediately in Crimea, and that was another one of those incidents that Crimean people said, this is the last straw. We cannot be in a country like this. We didn't want to be in it before necessarily, but it was, okay, we found a way to exist. We can't exist like this anymore. And they decided to hold the referendum. We got a lot of the details from people who were involved in the activities in the capital, Simferopol, and actually they held the Crimea-wide referendum within just a few weeks, held by the normal electoral council, and it was decisive. 83% voting, 97% saying we want to secede from Ukraine, we want to reunify with Russia. And those people who didn't vote.
But do you think that's what's going to happen with East Ukraine, where Luhansk and where Donetsk and Luhansk, or the Donbass it'll either like Crimea, vote to be part of Russia, or just be an independent state which is only recognized by Russia and much of the international community, but not NATO members and EU members.
No, they did hold referendums back about 6 months ago, 5 or 6 months ago. They did hold referendums, and the results were decisive. Now, given it's a wartime situation, given the Civil War, given the number of people who had left, I think it would make sense to, maybe the referendum needs to be redone. Probably a good solution would be to have a referendum and to abide by the vote. Let the people there decide. But at this point, it's gone too far in a way. I think actually that's not possible. Unfortunately, it would have been possible. That's why this war is so unnecessary. If the West, the ones who pushed it, the ones who wanted the war was the West.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with Iraq. Iraq wanted, the U.S. wanted to invade Iraq. They did everything to make it possible, to make sure it happened. For example, there was the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons.
Yeah.
That is an international body that is in charge with that. They offered to go in and make all the inspections and to confirm whether or not Iraq had WMDs.
And even if Iraq did, but also even if Iraq did have WMDs, it came from the West. So I mean,
but they did.
I mean, I think it really just goes back to, in the end of the day, the reason why this tragedy, this ongoing tragedy, and I think it's awful that Russia felt that they had no other choice but to do the invasion, and of course innocent lives get lost anytime there's war. But if we want to actually have a world beyond war, the only way we can get to a level like that is we have to eradicate the institution of imperialism and Anglo-American, pan-European empires. That has to end. Mm-hmm. And I think it's sad for Ukraine that Ukraine can't be the united country I think it deserves to be, but that's but I again like you, I completely blame NATO and the propaganda machine that has and the propaganda
Yeah,
machine with that.
Russia was completely open with Ukraine being part of the European Union, having friendly economic relations there, trading with, being a bridge between the East and the West, trading with Russia, getting the benefit of cheap gas and oil from Russia, being a corridor for gas and oil to the West, which they made, they had good, they made money through having the pipelines that was the conduit for that. Russia was open to Ukraine being a friend of the West as well as the East. What Russia had a problem with was Ukraine being not only anti-Russophobic and doing all sorts of aggressions against its Russian heritage people, which are significant. It's not like 2 or 3% of the population. It's like 30 or 40% of the population. And being a preparatory, preparing for a potential threat against Russia. That's what that's what it boiled down to. And Crimea is, we say in the articles, Crimea is emblematic of the Ukraine crisis overall, because Crimea was willing to go along and be part of Ukraine until Ukraine crossed that threshold where it was really hostile to a significant portion of its population, which is the majority of the population in eastern Ukraine and Crimea. You can't live under a government which is telling you can't speak your native language. We don't respect your culture. The hate is one way.
Funny. And actually, it's funny that you mentioned, because the irony of all of this is that you have you have Ukrainians, you have Eastern Europeans who do have some legitimate grievances, towards Russia, saying Russia under the Tsars and under the USSR colonized us and discriminated against our language, but now it's like kind of like reverse racism then with with the Ukraine, instead of just saying, okay, we have a Ukrainian identity, but there's also but that doesn't just mean Ukrainians of the Ukrainian-speaking Orthodox Church and so forth. We have our Ukrainians of a Russian background, Ukrainians of a Polish background, and which is why it's disgusting, the revisionist junk history of Stepan Bandera. But again, this is imperialism. This is Western imperialism, and that's why I find it so very tragic, very tragic. But then the second to last question, my second to last question then is this, and for people who say that I'm too soft on Russia, I've been trying my best to be objective and critical of Russia, hence why my questions have been a bit soft. But then so final question and final second to last question for final response is it's this. Lula gave a press conference, said that there needs to be exhaustive diplomatic solutions to the conflict. He said both Zelensky and Putin don't talk of peace. Both need to start, however, the difficult dialogue and end this conflict. He condemned very politely and diplomatically Biden, who kept talking about escalating the conflict. Lula found both parties at fault, said the U.S. and its allies need to stop escalating the conflict by sending arms. And there are some anti-imperialist forces and anti-war groups who I think share both of those perspectives. But some of your voices, but some people though in our movement believe that this is an inter-imperialist conflict, and I wanted your thoughts on that, because some of the views that Russians who spoke to our mutual comrade Dmitry Lascaris, who's been on the program many times, they spoke about that. Some of them talked about erasing Ukraine. Some have talked about not just liberating Ukrainians of a Russian background in the East, but even they said that even the concept of Ukraine as an independent country should be eliminated. Jeff Cohen, who's been on this program, the founder of FAIR, leading U.S. media critic, part of Roots Action, he said on this program that if you read and listen to Putin's speech when he announced the special military operations, he spoke of Russia as a neo-Tsarist country and of a greater Russia. And the recent follow-up documentary to Ukraine on Fire, produced by Oliver Stone, great documentary. Putin in this follow-up documentary, in an interview, he subtly talked of Ukraine simply being absorbed into the Russian Federation. So given all of that, is there some truth that this is an inter-imperialist conflict? And if you reject that thesis, do explain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do reject that thesis. I think it's fundamentally inaccurate. I also reject the interpretation of Putin's speeches, which I've read carefully. In contrast with Biden's speeches or the speeches of American leaders, which are mostly PR, they're public relations, and they will say things and not give much detail or background. In contrast with that, Russian leaders, whether it's Lavrov or the spokesperson Peskov or Putin, they give speeches and they give a lot of explanation, a lot of detail, and they're very frank and they're very honest and about the reasons for things and what they think. If anything, they've leaned toward the side of trying to accommodate the West. For years and years, up until very recently, they would speak about our partners in the West, whereas the United States always talked about Russia in hostile terms as an adversary. Russia, up until the SMO, was talking about their partner in the West. I challenge anybody to go back and reread Putin's speeches of February 22 and February 24 of 2022, which are the nights before they, number one, accepted treaties with the People's Republic of Lugansk and Donetsk, the two different People's Republics which had been set up there, and then the night before they launched the special military operation, because he does not speak of absorbing Ukraine. He does speak about the Kiev's attacks on the Russian communities in the West, and he does in the first of those speeches. He does talk a lot about the history and how Ukraine, it was rather arbitrary how Donetsk and Lugansk were placed within Ukrainian boundaries. That was completely arbitrary, and there wasn't much sense to it. And it's a critique of Lenin's views of nationalism at that time. And then, but at the same time, it's also clear that he's saying we don't want Kiev. Kiev is their brothers and their sisters. They're not Russian, and so I think the people either who are making these claims, either they haven't read the speeches or they've given a very twisted interpretation of them. So number one, I think factually, Putin never said that. If anything, he said, Ukraine can make their own choices. You want decommunization, it's your choice. But at the same time, if when you're attacking Russian communities and threatening us, that's a different thing. So I think the view is fundamentally wrong. The fundamental view that it's an inter-imperialist rivalry between U.S. empire versus Russian empire, I think that's fundamentally false. Russia's never claimed to be the exceptional country in the world. Russia's never claimed to be the decider of the rules-based order. Russia said let's all follow international law. So I think in reality, it's what the Chinese and the Russian are saying, and what many other people and countries are saying. what's at stake here is U.S. hegemony and the unipolar world, which is a world driven by the U.S. And the opportunity is a multipolar world where nations respect sovereignty, and not everybody has to agree about everything, but non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, so that China and Russia can both talk with Saudi Arabia, saying, despite disagreeing about this or that, despite having some bad history about this or that, they can negotiate and they can conduct negotiations. Russia's had good relations with Saudi Arabia because they're both in OPEC, and they're both major oil producing countries. And Russia, has relations with Israel, of course, despite having a lot of criticisms. But
and despite the anti-imperialist movement, who actually wishes that China and Russia actually had a much more hardline attitude against Israel, against Saudi Arabia, but
yeah, but I think that the truth is that what's at stake here is really the U.S. empire, and that's why the U.S. keeps escalating and says that we can't afford to lose in Ukraine. Of course, the war is not between Moscow and Kiev. The war is between Moscow and Washington, and to some extent Brussels. So
actually,
if the U.S. was
not to some extent, large extent, people are far too soft on Belgium, Germany, France, and so forth. It's a pan-European. It's pan-European imperialism, and all of it needs to be eradicated. I don't, but which is what NATO is, and it's unfortunately the direction that the EU keeps going, really shifting to the right, especially when it comes to imperialism. And
well, exactly, and what we've seen with the Nord Stream bombing, that Germany, we used to think it was an independent state. It turns out it's a vassal state. They can't even speak up or tell the truth about something that has a huge impact on their own economy. They're totally under the thumb of the U.S. and the west of Europe is as well. And now it's clear that the European Union, people think of the European Union as being, existing for centuries. No, this was created in the era of neoliberalism after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it was much more the U.S. was able to manipulate one organization, the EU, which is unelected, than a bunch of different small countries where they could, argue for their own national interests.
Fascinating, in the future, let's organize, if possible, a very polite, cordial, debates when it comes to these topics, because I do, because I do disagree with some of the perspectives of some of our fellow anti-imperialists or more specifically anti-war peace movement, but hey, this is a great conversation. And all right, now before we end the program, we have to do the questionnaire that was done first by Marcel Proust, later the popular French broadcaster Bernard Pivot, then done by my hero James Lipton of Inside the Actors Studio. Rick, it's your turn to do this before I let you enjoy the rest of your Sunday with your guest. Rick, what is your favorite word?
Youri. I like independence.
Okay. What's your least favorite word?
Let's see. The
term tanky.
What's that?
The term tanky that they use to describe us who are against the pivot to Asia, who are against NATO, who are against Western Gulf imperialism in Syria.
Okay, yeah, that's a good one. Inter-imperialist. That's one I don't care for.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
What?
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Uh, nature, walking in nature, being in nature.
And what turns you off then?
Uh, Traffic jams.
Oh yeah, Jesus, yeah, California. Even in Belgium, nothing but traffic jams. What's your favorite curse words?
Caramba.
Caramba. Okay,
My partner,
good
my
Spanish. Yeah, good
wife
Spanish.
slash partner is Peruvian.
Okay. What sound or noise do you love, followed by what sound or noise do you dislike?
Ah, birds chirping is very nice to wake up in the morning, and uh,
And then the sound you dislike then would be
maybe a musician, a screeching violin. That's one that I don't care for.
really like the psycho killing scene that Alfred Hitchcock going
No,
like
no,
that
no.
kind of.
Just a violin. Not the psycho killing scene. The just the a youngster who's just learning to play the violin.
Ah, okay. Okay. What profession, if you weren't doing all the brilliant journalism, very underrated your journalism, by the way. So if you weren't doing the brilliant independent journalism and the NGO criticisms and all that people power stuff you do, what would you have liked to have done?
Ah, I like the journalism. I just wish I'd started it a lot earlier.
Wow, brilliant response. And what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
I've I've you know factory work, which I've done. Any job where you're looking at the clock every couple of minutes.
Yeah, I agree.
I've got a lot of respect for people who do that because they do it because they have to, and they get used to it. But boy, it's tough. So I've got a lot of respect for that. Truck drivers also. I've got a lot of respect for truck drivers, which is a tough job, and it's one that is insufficiently respected. It's the most common job. There's more truck drivers than any other profession in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
West, at
yeah,
least.
yeah. The Amazons, the Deliveroos, all those 0 hour contracts. Yeah, I completely agree with you. This is why we need to have a socialist revolution to make sure that they get the wages that they deserve. Lastly, lastly, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say as you arrive at the pearly gates, or whatever is your vision or belief in the afterlife? And you don't have to be cheeky, even if you're an atheist. You can still answer this question. Still struggling to come up with the answer?
That one is tough because the idea of living to eternity, I don't know, that somehow doesn't even appeal to me. I think we've got a limited time on Earth. Make the most of it, enjoy it as much as you can, and then pass on the baton to the next generation. So.
This is Rick's sneaky atheism, but basically, hey, if there is an afterlife with multiple gods and so forth, I'm pretty sure what you want to hear is you can finally rest in peace, right? Alrighty, well, we were joined on this
Okay.
wonderful epic edition of One Plus One with Rick Sterling, brilliant, independent journalist, media critic, NGO critic, anti-imperialist campaigner, uh, whose work is published at
Yes.
Mintpress News,
And yeah, and
Consortium News,
yeah.
consortiumnews.com. But follow him specifically nowadays. He has his work published at antiwar.com. I've just last night I read parts one and the soon to be published part two. Rick has a series that's going to be published in antiwar.com about his trip to Russia with Dan Kovalik, and hopefully in the future we can organize a proper. Hopefully we can organize a debate, if, as long as people stick to the rules, that it has to be a polite one. And I'll just say, I really hope that I really don't want the war in Ukraine to last any longer. I really do hope it ends soon. I really do hope that a true peaceful solution, which is possibly a united Ukraine, but if that doesn't happen, I know who I'm blaming, and it's the West to blame for that. So, as the folks of World Beyond War say, Russia out of Ukraine, but NATO out of existence. And Rick, thank you so much for taking the time on, and as always, looking forward to having you back on in the future.
Okay, yeah, appreciate it, Youri. Yeah, all the best.